Hi, I'm Dejan Stojanovic from the Difficult Bird Research Group at the ANU. I'm reporting today on the outcomes of NESP Project 2.2, which funded my salary to look at threats to endangered Tasmanian hollow nesting birds. This project was focused on three species: swift and orange-bellied parrots and the 40-spotted pardalote. At the time the project began, there were varying levels of knowledge about each. Swift parrots were well studied, having been the focus of 2 PhDs and 2 postdocs. We knew they were critically endangered by the impacts of predatory gliders, but there remained major gaps in knowledge about the scale of the problem and whether it could be managed. Likewise, there was no knowledge about population genetics, which hindered evaluation of impacts of threats on extinction risk. 40-spotted pardalotes also had benefited from a PhD project in the DBRG, and we knew the species was at risk from the unusual threat of parasitism. However, there was no knowledge about how to deal with the problem, and there was limited information about the species' occurrence and abundance across its range. Orange-bellied parrots had declined to only 2 wild-born breeding mothers in 2016, so we began our project during a time of crisis. Although subject to decades of intervention, they were poorly studied. Knowledge gaps about their ecology and the identity of threats meant that there was uncertainty about what new actions were needed and whether existing actions were effective. Over the life of the project, we produced 21 research papers. This comprised 9 studies on each parrot, plus another 3 on the pardalote. To place this effort in context, we produced more studies on OBPs in 3 years than had been produced in the preceding 30. In the coming slides, I'll discuss these outputs sequentially for each species to demonstrate what we learned, and then I'll outline needs for future conservation work. We began with a strong knowledge of the threats faced by the swift parrot, so we focused our efforts on identifying ways to help. The research fell into 3 categories: quantifying the impacts of gliders, identifying and testing management solutions, and contributing to general knowledge of ecology. First, we'll look at studies quantifying the impacts of gliders. Honours student Mark Allen surveyed an important swift parrot breeding area, the southern forests, to study how widespread gliders were. He found they occurred at about 80% of sites, indicated by the black circles on the map, and that the likelihood of their occurrence increased with the proportion of mature forest that remained unlogged within 500 metres. This study corroborated earlier research showing that forest left standing in a logged matrix is important in predicting sugar glider impacts on swift parrots. The next study evaluated whether the shape of a swift parrot nest hollow can passively defend against predators. Parrots preferred hollows with small entrances and deep chambers, which was a good defence against native predators like currawongs or owls, but gliders could breach this defence, and there was no relationship between hollow shape and the survival of glider attacks. Here you see the only existing footage of a sugar glider predation event, in this case on a tree martin. Now to management options. Given the damage inflicted by sugar gliders, we invented possum keeper outerers, an automated door that closes over the nest entrance at night. In a field experiment using tree martins as a surrogate for swift parrots, we found that nest boxes fitted with PKOs had only a 25% chance of failing and never due to sugar glider predation, compared to 80% failure in controls. Although effective, PKOs are expensive and best suited to nest boxes where they neatly seal the entrance shut. As a result of the cost of their manufacture and deployment, PKOs are likely to only be used at small scales and don't really provide a landscape scale solution. Because of this limitation, we trialled a cheaper alternative approach. Honours student Giselle Owens designed an automated stereo system to broadcast the calls of predatory owls near unprotected bird nests at night. We hoped that sugar gliders might avoid areas where they perceived owls to be a threat. Unfortunately, if we succeeded in creating a landscape of fear, this did not translate into a reduced predation rate on birds. Disappointing, but good to know. Next, we teamed up with NRM South to evaluate the impact of sugar glider culling on bird nest survival. Using a combination of nest boxes baited with quail eggs and camera traps, we compared glider occurrence at 3 control and treatment sites, where sugar gliders were trapped and euthanized. We found no effect of culling on glider occurrence, and the probability of quail eggs being predated was better explained by site level variation than by treatment group. Furthermore, gliders proved very difficult to trap, with only 9 caught over 3 months. Worst of all, a real swift parrot nest was killed by gliders in the middle of a glider trapping grid. This left us with major doubts about the feasibility of glider culling as a management tool. Although NRM South have since trialled other trapping techniques, similar results leave us back at the drawing board. Together, these studies show that we've only just scratched the surface of glider management to protect birds, and much work remains to be done. Given the cost of glider management, combined with the limited landscape applicability of the few solutions that do work, we conclude that the most effective way and cost-effective way to protect swift parrots is to focus on habitat. However, we also had successes. For example, we showed that it's possible to use surveys of flower buds in food trees during winter to predict where swift parrots might settle in the coming summer. Using this approach, we deployed nest boxes for swift parrots and recorded the first utilisation of artificial nests by this species in the wild. Nests in boxes and chainsaw-carved hollows produced similar numbers of healthy nestlings to birds breeding in natural hollows, which is good news for restoration. These nesting boxes remain in situ, and it is a high conservation priority to establish a mechanism for their ongoing maintenance. A follow-up study showed that nest boxes can't be treated as a one-time only management action. Compared to newly deployed boxes, 3-year-old boxes had a near 100% chance of being occupied by common starlings near forest edges, as shown in the middle figure here. Conversely, tree martins occupied nearly 100% of boxes deep inside the forest, especially for the established boxes, as shown in the bottom figure. Although the top figure shows that swift parrots used boxes over 2 years, especially near forest edges, competition was high in established boxes. This is an important lesson for managers so that restoration projects don't inadvertently breed pest species. We consider that a good conservation outcome would be for land managers to undertake annual surveys to predict where swift parrots will breed, and then either deploy new boxes in breeding habitat or to reopen established but sealed boxes. After the parrots leave the breeding area, boxes should then be sealed shut again so that the pests cannot exploit them while the parrots are gone. This approach hasn't yet been trialled, but is a highly important priority for future work. We also undertook 2 studies of population genetics of swift parrots. The first showed that, as predicted by their nomadic movements, the population is a single, randomly mating conservation unit. This finding supported a key assumption of earlier population viability analysis, which found the species met the criteria for listing as critically endangered. Our second genetic study evaluated the species' effective population size. Based on 5 years of DNA samples collected from 2010, we found that the effective population size of parrots was between 44 and 140. This corresponds to a census population size of potentially fewer than 300 individual birds. This is much less than previously estimated by experts, which, as this figure indicates, suggested for nearly 2 decades that there was more than 1,000 individual swift parrots. This genetic result is bad news, but it's critical that we know. And now to 40-spotted pardalotes. A PhD student from the DBRG had earlier discovered that a parasitic fly posed a major new threat to nest survival of pardalotes, but little information about their demographic rates or the impact of this and other threats was available to help inform conservation planning. So our research fell into 3 categories: evaluating if the habitat of pardalotes was well protected, determining baseline population size, and finding ways to protect them from parasites. Much of this new work was led by Fernanda Alves, an ANU DBRG PhD student. We first showed that on Bruny and Maria Islands, pardalotes had high occupancy rates of forests where their food tree occurs. But on Flinders Island, the species may have become extinct. We also found that most of the species' contemporary range was vulnerable to invasion by noisy miners, and other threats like wildfire and habitat loss posed existential risks to the surviving populations. This has important implications for where to focus on land reservation and habitat restoration. At North Bruny Island, Fernanda found that the density of pardalotes declined in areas dominated by small or dead trees, but increased where mature trees were abundant. These relationships are illustrated in this figure. Fernanda estimated the population size of North Bruny pardalotes was approximately 2,200 individuals, which is the first statistically reliable estimate of population size in this species. This has important implications both for the conservation assessments of this species and for habitat restoration. Focusing on protecting mature forests is likely to support more pardalotes than areas dominated by young trees, such as restoration plantings. Finally, Fernanda was able to find an ingenious solution to the parasitism of pardalotes. Chicken feathers impregnated with bird-safe insecticides were provided to the birds who love using feathers to line their nests. Self-medicated nests had 95% survival, compared to only 8% for controls. This solution is cheap and effective, but there's now an urgent need to test this technique at broad scales across pardalote habitat to see whether their population size can be increased by correcting parasitism. We hope to secure future funding to achieve this goal. And now to the orange-bellied parrot. Although there was an active management program for the species at the time we began this work, there remained many unanswered questions. Our project focused on three key themes: understanding ecology, evaluating management options, and considering the species' long-term viability. We began by evaluating the state of knowledge for the species, searching for other surviving populations, evaluating their population health and reproductive success, and trialling intensive interventions like fostering to correct infertility. We did not find OBPs anywhere other than Melaleuca. This means that this is truly the last population. The reproductive success of captive mothers was also lower than wild mothers in 2016. Likewise, the feather quality of captive birds was lower than wild ones, and there were more infertile captive nests than wild nests. We fostered 5 chicks into the infertile nests of released mothers, and one of these chicks survived to migrate. We identified lack of burning and resulting natural food shortages in the breeding ground as a threat to the species. We next looked at the captive population to seek explanations for their performance in the wild. We looked for evidence of adaptation to captivity using body mass as an indicator. Adult body mass of parrots didn't change over successive generations of captive breeding, suggesting that more direct measures were needed to evaluate if adaptation to captivity had occurred. As a potential explanation for suspected low survival of released birds, we began investigating whether the relationship between migration performance and wing shape might explain the low survival of orange-bellied parrots after release. As a first step, we compared the wing shapes of all the grass parrot species, including OBPs, to look for unique traits of migrants versus nomads and sedentary species. We found that the wing shapes of these grass parrots was similar irrespective of their purported migratory behaviour, indicating that to some extent these birds are all capable of long-distance flights. We then focused on OBPs and compared the wing shapes of captive parrots to their wild-born counterparts. Captive birds had shorter feathers on the leading edge of their wings and longer feathers in the mid-wing than wild birds, as indicated by the dotted lines in the figure. This shape was different not only to wild OBPs, but also to all other grass parrot species. This surprising and easily overlooked trait of captive birds might at least partly contribute to poor migration performance, but many questions remain unanswered about how this affects individual survival. In partnership with DPIPWI, we've recently taken on a new PhD student, Laura Bussolini, to explicitly investigate the captive population of orange-bellied parrots and to examine morphological changes of captive birds. This is critical because captive animals should resemble their wild counterparts as closely as possible. Understanding how changes in captivity arise and whether they can be corrected is critical for successful reintroduction. And now to management options. Lack of native food, driven by lack of fire, was identified as a major threat to OBPs. In collaboration with DPIPWI and national parks, we designed a before-after control impact experiment around an ecological burn planned for the OBP. We showed that although food abundance was low 1 year after fire, by year 2, food abundance had dramatically increased relative to unburned sites. This corresponded to the first evidence in contemporary times of OBPs foraging for native seed in fields of daisies that regenerated after the fire. Since that first fire, DPIPWI and national parks have developed a comprehensive burning plan. Ideally, in the next few weeks, there'll be another fire for the orange-bellied parrot, and we will expand our monitoring of food regeneration in the aftermath. A high priority identified by our first study was to find an objective way to evaluate the condition of nestlings that might be in need of management assistance. We developed models of nestling growth and used these to develop an objective body condition score based on wing length and body mass. Using this technique, we've been able to track patterns in body condition over time and link this to environmental conditions. For example, the figure shows that condition of all nestlings, irrespective of whether they were first, middle or last hatched, peaked in 2019, when native food plants were abundantly regenerating 2 years after fire. This body condition metric has proved useful in on-ground assessments of nestling health and has informed decisions around the management of unwell nestlings in the wild population. We also evaluated a management intervention aimed at relieving competition for nest boxes between OBPs and tree martins. Given tree hollows are very rare in OBP habitat, alleviating competition for breeding opportunities is critical. We found that destroying tree martin nests was ineffective at creating vacant nest boxes for parrots. Instead, nest destruction resulted in increased rates of nest box defence by cranky tree martins that were rebuilding their nests. Based on this result, alternative management approaches like translocation and removal of tree martins have since been trialled by DPIPWI. For the last of our management studies, we evaluated what did and didn't work while implementing the OBP project, and provided a list of suggestions for other practitioners seeking to implement similar work as a how-to guide. Importantly, this study provided critical transparency about sensitive matters, for example, parrot or nest mortality. Given adverse events can happen, we are proud to have led a frank and transparent discussion about how to handle and overcome them in context of conservation projects like ours. For example, we used cameras mounted inside nest boxes as a means of increasing the resolution of nest monitoring data. But some nests were abandoned by mother parrots that were frightened by the hardware. So we overcame this problem by trialling the use of dummy cameras on all nest boxes, which could be swapped out for real cameras in active nests and thus reduce the risk of abandonment. Such practical lessons can be easily transferred to other species, and we hoped to prevent other projects from needing to reinvent the wheel. In our last study on the orange-bellied parrot, we considered the long-term prognosis for the species by evaluating patterns of survival over 22 years. We found that the OBP population suffered a chronic decline of juvenile survival, illustrated in this figure. We showed that in order to achieve population recovery, it's critical that threats be addressed concurrently both in Tasmania and elsewhere in its winter and migration habitats. Even though efforts in Tasmania can correct local threats, OBPs still succumb to other unaddressed threats in the migration and winter range. The medium to long-term persistence of the orange-bellied parrot hinges on overcoming this spatial challenge. So where does this leave us? Several key issues must still be addressed for each species in order to achieve recovery. Foremost is addressing the impact of habitat loss. In the case of the swift parrot, better understanding of the extent of deforestation and accounting for its impacts using population viability analysis is an obvious next step. However, even without further modelling, our available information strongly points to an urgent need to protect the remaining mature forests where the species breeds. Without immediate cessation of logging in the mature forests of the swift parrot important breeding areas, and the tightening of government policy that currently makes this corporate behaviour legal, we consider it unlikely that the swift parrot population will be able to recover. This has further implications for other recovery actions, because ongoing logging of mature forests will mean that even if, for example, the species is bred in captivity, it will be very difficult to re-establish it in the wild when habitat loss remains an unaddressed threat. 40-spotted pardalotes also require adaptive management of their habitat, including the use of nest boxes and feather dispensers. These should be deployed at large spatial scales over their island habitats to test whether their numbers can be increased by active management. Likewise, the use of nest boxes, whether for increasing breeding opportunities for swift parrots or promoting the expansion of the orange-bellied parrot population into its historical range, should be evaluated in the context of improved management of tree hollows and sugar glider predation risk. Fundamentally though, despite the many unanswered questions that remain, our project has highlighted how strong, targeted science can be used to identify and solve the practical problems that on-ground managers need to do their jobs. Without careful, experimental field studies, most of the threats that we identified would have remained undetected or unresolved. Until recently, the orange-bellied parrot and its chronic decline was a stark example of how close to extinction a species can come when their conservation efforts are not shaped by robust science. OBPs also illustrate the importance of designing and trialling management interventions early enough to avoid population collapse, because after numbers become very small, even minor problems can become existential ones. The research priorities for our group are now shaped by the lessons we learned over the life of this project. For all three of these birds, better incorporation of genetic information will become increasingly important as their populations shrink. Likewise, integrating our updated understanding of threats, ecology, and management options into a population viability framework will help us to better model how our actions might affect extinction risk in these species. Captive breeding is also becoming a prominent approach used in the management of threatened species, and our research is looking more closely at when and how this approach should be used, as well as seeking clarity about its limitations and how to overcome them. Overall, this project achieved a lot in a short time because we leveraged additional funds, including crowdfunding, and tapped into the diverse work of the Difficult Bird Research Group students and early career researchers. We contributed new knowledge and improved current and future management actions, and broadened our understanding of these species and the habitats on which they depend. Crucially, as well as answering questions, we clarified research priorities for the future and developed a network of collaborations with on-ground managers to ensure a clear pathway from research to conservation action. Support for species conservation is rare, and given the resource-limited nature of the field, our project is an example of how robust conservation science pays off and can help prioritise competing actions based on efficacy, cost, and feasibility. This approach is critical if we are to sustain efforts to protect these species into the long term. Thanks very much to my colleagues in the Difficult Bird Research Group that contributed to this work. Particular thanks to the many early career scientists whose work was featured today, and to Rob Heinsohn for his support.